If you're familiar with the classic TV series Star Trek: The Next Generation, then you know that the show varies wildly in the subjects and themes that it explores. The show aired a total of 178 episodes from 1987 to 1994, and not all of those episodes aged as gracefully as others, but the episodes that did stand the test of time are some of the best science fiction that you'll find anywhere. One such episode is called The Game, and if you've seen the episode, and if you're alive in the current year, then you probably already know where I'm going with this video. Because this episode made an eerily accurate prediction about our current relationship with technology. So, did the writers of Star Trek: The Next Generation predict the phenomenon of social media addiction? And if so, what does that tell us about science fiction writing more broadly? Let's explore that question on The Art of Storytelling. There is no single definition of science fiction, but one of its defining features is that it is speculative. It anticipates the future consequences of present circumstances. As an art form, it walks a kind of tightrope between serious social commentary and campy escapism. And Star Trek: The Next Generation, it must be admitted, has its fair share of camp. That said, a lot of its social commentary is surprisingly profound and quite prescient. It's actually pretty impressive how much of Star Trek's sci-fi speculation has already become a reality. Jean-Luc Picard reads the news from what looks eerily similar to an iPad. This device is presumably connected to some kind of invisible digital communications network of some kind. The computer interfaces have these glossy touchscreen panels, and the ship's artificially intelligent supercomputer can communicate intuitively using language. This is all the more impressive when you remember that these ideas were conceived by TV writers in 1987. Long before the internet was mainstream, in a time when even home computing was still just a twinkle in Steve Jobs' eye. This raises the obvious question: how were these storytellers able to make such uncanny predictions about the future of technology? One of the greatest science fiction writers of all time, Isaac Asimov, once said, "Science fiction writers foresee the inevitable." And it's kind of interesting that he says they foresee the inevitable, not that they foresee the possible. I think this is where science fiction diverges from the adjacent genre of fantasy. It's less about imagining far-fetched possibilities and more about making informed speculation about the real future of the real world. And it's not just guesswork, it's grounded in a logical extrapolation of reality. So let's keep all of that before our minds as we look at Season 5, Episode 6, The Game. The episode picks up with Commander Riker on one of his jaunty love affairs with an extraterrestrial lover. So right away we get a hint that the story's themes are temptation and pleasure. She puts a strange-looking ocular device onto his head that she calls a game.
Everyone here is playing it.
Note her horizontal pupils. I don't trust her. When the device is activated, we get Riker's POV. He's seeing a kind of augmented reality called the playing field. The goal is to make the floating discs go into the cone, and when he asks how to do so, she instructs him to just turn off your mind. When he succeeds in doing so, he feels a rush of pleasure that she calls a reward. When Riker asks how far the game goes, she says,
"As far as you can take it."
So the game has no objective and infinite levels. Back on the Enterprise, Riker tries to convince his fellow crew members to try the game. His first taker is Deanna Troi, in a scene in which she explains her technique for savoring chocolate ice cream with clear sexual undertones. Riker tells her that he's got something even better, but qualifies that with the reassurance that it's just a game, and it isn't long before Troi is pushing the game on other crew members. The protagonist of the story is the recurring character Wesley Crusher, who is visiting the Enterprise while on leave from Starfleet Academy. He's joined by Ensign Leffler, played by a young Ashley Judd, and the two have their own romantic subplot. The mystery deepens when Dr. Crusher deactivates Data, who would be the only crew member not susceptible to the game. Data always gets deactivated. The game continues spreading throughout the crew, but when Wesley's mother tries to push it on him, he refuses because he's got a date in 10 Forward with Leffler. On that date, the two young characters talk about how they're seeing the game all over the ship, and they notice a random crew member near their table playing the game. I want to pause here for a second because I think this shot is one of the most chillingly dystopian shots in the entire Next Generation series. The actor does a brilliant job here because her expression communicates pleasure, but also a kind of anxious desperation. And look at her body language. Her head is kind of listing off to one side, and her hands are clutching the armrests. This is what we look like when we're scrolling. In a way, it's even creepier than the show's more sinister characterization of human-machine interfaces. When Wesley asks if she thinks it's strange that suddenly everybody is playing this game, Leffler insists.
It's just a fad. It's here this week. Next week, we won't even know it existed.
In any case, they analyze the device and they find that it stimulates the pleasure centers of the brain and it bonds with neurotransmitters, not unlike an addiction. It also affects the prefrontal cortex, which controls higher reasoning. Wesley tries to warn Captain Picard, but it's revealed to the audience that even he is already scrolling through memes in his reading room. Pretty soon, our heroes piece together that the game is actually a threat to the Enterprise. As it turns out, Riker's salacious alien lover is using the devices to control the minds of the crew. After a thrilling chase scene, Wesley Crusher is forced to play the game. Nice little Kubrick nod here. But then Data, who has been repaired by Wesley off-screen, uses a flashlight to undo the mind-controlling effects of the game. The episode ends with a wholesome romantic scene between Wesley and Leffler, a nice counterpoint to Riker's promiscuity, which got us in this mess. Moral of the story? Beware the corrupting temptation of short-term, superficial pleasures. So, as you can see, there are a lot of obvious parallels to social media addiction in this story. The first and most obvious is the fact that the device hijacks the brain's reward mechanisms in a way not dissimilar to social media. Second, the device engages the mind passively. It's not difficult to put the discs into the cones.
If you just let the game happen, it almost plays itself.
In fact, if you just switch your mind off, the game will do it for you, sort of like a super intelligent computer that analyzes your behavior in order to keep you stimulated. Third, the device affects your ability to reason and inculcates you with ideas that overwhelm your critical faculties. And fourth, the technology is owned and controlled by extraterrestrials bent on world domination. These are all compelling points, but am I reading too much into this story and inventing connections that the authors did not intend? After all, this episode was written in the 90s, so clearly the authors didn't intend the story as an allegory for social media addiction. They were probably thinking of the addictions of their own time, like drugs and alcohol and gambling. And this is why I brought up Asimov's point about science fiction writers seeing the inevitable. Science fiction writers don't just comment on the issues of their own time, they're interested in the deeper currents in human life. They might ask, what happens when a human being is able to gamble inside of a virtual reality headset? They might ask what happens when a human being is able to strap TikTok directly onto their face. At the heart of both of these questions is an even deeper question about human nature and the ramifications of inventing tools that help us to hack our own pleasure-seeking brains. Good science fiction stories are about running the program of today and seeing where it takes you in the future. And I think that's the inevitability that Asimov is referring to. And in the case of this particular episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, the inevitable consequence of our pleasure-seeking brains is all too familiar and a little bit scary. But I'd like to know what you think. Is it right to say that this episode of Star Trek correctly predicted social media addiction? Or would it be a misreading of the text to graft our own issues onto a story told for an audience in the past? Let me know what you think in the comments. Please subscribe if you think I should keep making videos, and I'll see you on the next one.